Hey, let's talk about witchcraft. So I've been an eclectic pagan for most of my life now, and it's only been in the last couple of years that I've really committed to a single pagan worldview and a couple magical traditions. And I've found that it's been worth it for me to go deep into a few rather than spread myself kind of thin. So today I want to talk about you, a beginner witch, or maybe a witch of quite a few years who is experiencing a bit of an itch to ditch the mix and match eclectic nature of modern witchcraft. So first, why the itch at all? In my personal opinion, again, speaking only for myself, my own perspective, don't come at me, there's something about choosing a specialist area in witchcraft that feels a bit more sophisticated. Like, it's one thing to study literature in college, but it's a whole other thing to go on to graduate school or get a PhD in like women's poetry of the 20th century, you know what I'm saying? Now, I'm not saying that you cannot be an expert by being an eclectic, but it helps to start learning and deepening your practice somewhere. Most modern witchcraft, from blogs to books, emphasize starter spells that kind of scratch the surface of the respective traditions that they come from. For instance, if you are really into like crystals or plants, that's kind of like a gateway into animism or green witchcraft. Or mantras for manifestation are kind of a beginner course, a slice of the larger pool of scholarship around invocation, evocation, and the power, magical power of speech. So in other words, choosing a specialization, it only provides you with like the resources that might just interest you, but it's also a pathway to an expertise. With the fundamentals down and some basic fluency in the different options that you have, choosing a specialization allows you to go deep. It allows you to leave the hiking trail in favor of a thicker wilderness. But much like the wilderness, there are dangers there. Dangers to be aware of that come with certain traditions. So this is one reason that choosing a magical specialization might not be for everyone. Workings and crafts that come from starter books, like starter spells, that's enough for most people. They help with like basic home protection or career advancement or healing. And I think that's a really good thing. Like, if we go back to the PhD analogy, we don't expect every student who goes to college to go on to graduate school. We expect them to master the fundamentals and hopefully walk away with a love for learning. But for those of you with an eye on the wilderness, I want to offer a few prompts that might help you sort of uncover the different magical specializations that might be right for you. This is just meant to help you explore your options. Of course, if there's already something that calls to you, pursue that. Maybe it's your ancestors' tradition, your ethnic tradition. It could be a book that you picked up recently that really sparked you. No one method is going to tell you what your specialty is meant to be. You get to choose that. Nothing can replace a true passion for a subject of study. But for the rest of us who feel a little bit lost and need a compass, these are a few prompts that I hope can help you on your journey. I'm going to offer 4 prompts today. They are the astrological approach, the archetypal approach, the trial and error approach, and the inner child approach. So let's get started. So the first approach I want to talk about is the astrological approach. So depending on who you ask, different astrological houses and planets are going to be more effective in determining what your natural affinity and magical practice might be. Personally, I'm a fan of the 5th, 8th, 10th, and 12th houses for this, but the ascendant is pretty crucial too. So an astrological approach to determining your natural magical skill set would essentially be an analysis of your houses, your planets, and determining where you might have a natural expression, a tendency for scholarship, or a interest in the occult. There's not a one-size-fits-all method to this, and I highly recommend that if you want to use this sort of method in a divinatory fashion, like you want it to determine your next year of study as an experiment, you should really consult a professional astrologer. But if you want to do this more casually and you want to just sort of pick a few things, see where they lead you, and use it more as a prompt, here's a few places that I would suggest looking. The first would be your Pluto placement. So Pluto is associated with the occult, we all know that, but it's a very creative planet because it creates and destroys, it destroys in order to create. So whatever house Pluto is in might give you an idea of where you have, basically where you can tap into those blessings of being able to start over, of being able to regenerate. So for me, Pluto is in my 4th house, and I feel that hard. The house is the home, and I am constantly moving, I'm constantly redecorating. I have had multiple panic attacks about the fact that I bought this house and we live here because now I can't hop around. And my moves are not down the street or just a new apartment. I always move drastically. I'm a country hopper. I have lived out of a suitcase since I was really young. But it makes sense that things around my home environment are where I have a lot of occult interests. Different spiritual energies that might exist in different rooms of a home protection magic, cottage witchery. These are naturally interesting to me because of my Pluto placement. But another planet that you could look at is Mercury. So Mercury is the planet that's closest to the sun, and the sun is essentially your soul essence. Basically, Mercury can tell not only what you desire most, but it can create pathways, it can create plans, it can create study habits, it can create a structure with which you can understand, analyze, and interact with the world that then satisfies your soul. As an example, my Mercury is in Aquarius in the 6th house. And while I don't associate the 6th house with magic per se, I do associate it with magical herbalism and healing. This might point to why when I'm really in need of outside influence or help, I always turn to the plant kingdom and communication with the plant kingdom to lead the way. I learn more from trees than I do from people. Kind of makes sense. So another way that you can determine where your magical talents lie is just by looking at the planet that rules your chart overall. So every chart has a ruler, and if your ruler is, say, Saturn, you might be well suited to magical workings that help take chaos and put it into structure. You might want to have influence in power structures or financial systems. So as a reminder, your chart is complex and there are so many different ways to read it. It's a whole system and you can't just look at a few things and like X equals Y. It's always more complex than that. But I do encourage you to take some time to study it, see how they fit together, and look for trends that could lead you toward a magical affinity. Or find an astrologer that you trust and have them help you read your chart. So another approach would be the archetypal approach. Now, if you're a secular witch, I'm not sure how well this will click with you. I don't really know how much secular witches interact with archetypes and mythology on a spiritual plane. So if you are a secular witch, I would love to hear what you think about archetypes, how you work with them, and put that in a comment below. I'm really interested. But if you're a polytheistic magical practitioner or you work with archetypes at all, this can be a really effective way to identify what clicks with you naturally. So when I say archetypal approach, I guess what I'm really saying is like, what god or goddess or mythological figure, natural creature or mythological creature just seems to vibe with you? What do you personally identify with? Who or what do you feel bonded to? Like, my handle is literally Leafy Dryad, so you can probably guess what I bond with. The magic that this being or creature or archetype is associated with, or even emerges from, could point to where you would be called. So let me give you an example. I have a huge thing for animals, but very specific ones in very different ways. So for me, moths, pumas, grizzly bears, and whales are frequent teachers of my consciousness and my practice. They're frequent sources of inspiration, and I feel like I call on them almost as often, if not as often, as I call on deities. I call on them when I cast circles, I call on them in my prayers. If you've watched my content before, you know that I have been devoted to Isis for years, and I've recently become more and more devoted to Ariane Road, and she's taking a higher pedestal every day in my practice. And both of those goddesses are associated with animals of flight. A kite and an owl. Both are seen as wisdom keepers. So when I combine all of this, I find that yes, I am a Mercury dominant person, and I have a deep attachment to things like ecosystems of forests and deserts and mountains. That's why my magic focuses on communication with and stewardship of the natural world. From trees to animal spirits to stones, I've grown to become a very animistic, ecologically oriented witch, and that is the way I express my spiritual practice. That's where I choose to pursue magical depth. So what about you? Are you attached to Aphrodite? In which case, you may have an affinity for love magic or water and ocean magic. Perhaps you're attached to Freya, in which case shamanism could really be up your alley. Are you attached to landscapes like that of the far north and the stars and the ice sheets? Then maybe hedge witchery is for you. Or do you long for the lands of your cultural background? In which case, the indigenous tradition of your people might be calling you to be a keeper of that wisdom for this generation. Like, deciphering meaning from our natural attachments, it's a personal exploration, and you may want to use a journal or voice record some stream of consciousness to let yourself think about these concepts really freely, openly, and honestly, and see where they lead you. What aspects of the world and magic and witchcraft are so attractive to you in the first place? So why shouldn't a deep dive into the specialization that's meant for you also include a deep dive into yourself? Try talking to your family too. If you are really drawn to archetypes like the warrior or the high priest, maybe healers, you may find that something exists in your family tree or your cultural background that is emerging in your life experience. traditions. Okay, so trial and error. This is pretty straightforward, but basically if you are super stumped and you don't know where to start, or you feel like you can't make a choice, or you don't like that you have to make a choice, maybe you just hate having to choose, you should go with a trial and error approach. Log what and when you practice, where those spells came from, where you sourced them from, maybe you wrote them. Log how successful they were and how you felt afterward. How did you feel during the act? Did you feel like you were forcing yourself? Did you feel awkward, or did it just come naturally to you? Or were you uncomfortable but in a good way, like you were gonna grow into these bigger shoes? Give yourself permission to explore beginner levels of witchcraft across a variety of traditions. See what areas you keep coming back to. For example, maybe psychic witchcraft sounds really interesting, but you keep putting it off, and that's because that's all it is. It just sounds cool. But maybe you also just have an urge to add some herbs to your cooking and chant over the kneading of bread dough, in which case, kitchen witchery is for you. Like, going back to that PhD analogy, no one wakes up in the morning and says, I'm gonna get a PhD in queer 20th century poetry. Like, no, that doesn't happen. People reach that point after they have read widely and thoroughly through a variety of literatures, and they find what they are passionate about and what they're willing to dedicate years and years and years of study to. So give yourself permission to try, but also give yourself permission to fail. It might take a few months, it might take a few years, but you'll find what sticks. Talent is one thing, but skill really does take time. If skill is what you want, you need to give yourself not only time to develop that skill, but you need to make time to practice it, to put it into action. So experiment and log your experiments. And number 4, the inner child. Probably the most whimsical of them all. So if it's healthy and mentally safe for you to do so, I encourage you to close your eyes and think back to when you were a child. Before adults were asking you, what you wanted to be when you grew up, or what did you want from life, before you had any understanding of like money and responsibility, what made you feel inspired? What made you lose track of time? What were you so eager to do when you got home from school? So for me, I lost myself in telling stories with my dolls. My dolls were fairies and mermaids and people from other worlds. I used to go on these long walks in the woods, and I would just touch and talk to trees, and I would take forest floor scraps to build little fairy houses, and the next morning I'd go check to see if any fairies had tea there. And drawing, I did a lot of drawing. So that's what I embrace now as an adult. I let myself draw. I never have stopped connecting with trees, and I care a lot about the nymphs that reside in the wood. And I write stories. From a magical perspective, these things help me create the world that I want to live in. They help bring that sense of magic, that sense of wonder into my lived everyday reality. Through writing stories, or through painting pictures, or communicating with nymphs in the woods, I feel like I'm manifesting things. I'm drawing in energies and entities that I want to occupy space in my life. And I use tools from the forest to do my magic. So what about you? When you were a kid, were you the kind of child who just ran everywhere with blood pumping? Were you very physical and engaged with your body? There are forms of magic that are like that. Were you really musical as a child and dreamed of having your own band? Well, I got news for you. Hymns and chants and bardic study is a whole school of magic. My husband spent his whole childhood in the library, and now he is kind of like this magical researcher person. He's like a magical librarian. He collects books and information, and he shares it with his family and friends as they need it. That's the niche he's carved out for himself. So if your 8-year-old self were in the room with you right now, what would they want you to go and do? What about that childlike instinct is actually a reflection of something potent and deep and yearning in you? So those are my 4 ideas for how to find a magical specialization if you feel called to have one. So what about you? If you've been a witch for a really long time, have you changed paths? Have you specialized and unspecialized? I'm sure people new to the path would be really interested to hear your journey. And if you're a beginner, what kind of things are you looking into? What sparked your interest in the first place? For me, I've always been more of a polytheist first, and I always struggled to incorporate a magical essence into my daily life in a consistent way. But it was forest-oriented magics like druidry that really helped me bridge that connection and bring the two together. Sort of a spiritual outlook and a magical outlook. I needed something that could help me weave them, and druidry just did that for me and became a worldview. But I'm still eclectic on paper. I don't actually worship that many Celtic deities, and a lot of the actual magic I do is not really drawn from druidry. So on paper, the things I do are not really connected to one another, but they're connected for me. They're connected in my life and they work. I've chosen a few things that I go deep into and I love it. So I wish the same blessing on you, that you find a spiritual practice, a spiritual routine, a magical one that just resonates with you and makes your life feel that much more juicy, gives you goosebumps in the evening, and just is the icing on the cake of life. Yeah, please share below what paths that you followed or have changed paths, if you're new, if you're an experienced witch. I really think that your story could help others, so if you could share below, that would be awesome. I'm sure people want to hear your experience, and I do too. I'll see you down in the comments, and other than that, I will see you in this format next week. I hope your day is as pristine as a hazelnut. Toodles!